Hello, my name is Kathleen Carpenter, and the purpose of this session is to engage teachers in analyzing how they develop students' vocabulary during mathematics lessons, as well as to look at strategies for implementing more effective writing techniques in their mathematics lessons. Once you finish this session, if you have any further questions or feedback on the information, I would welcome a message to the email address shown on the screen. Before you begin this discussion, you want to gather first your grade level mathematics vocabulary list, or you may also use the mathematics vocabulary list that was attached to the email that was sent out about this presentation. You will also want to locate a recent mathematics assignment that would benefit from adding a writing component. It could also be one that you're planning to do in the near future. You will also need some chart paper and markers if you're working in a group. If you need to pause the presentation and go locate those things at this time, that would be a good thing to do now. So the first thing we want to discuss is kind of how students actually learn new vocabulary. And I'm drawing parallels to how we develop vocabulary across the curriculum, particularly in language arts. And I would say historically in mathematics, we have held on to this notion that if students learn a definition, they've learned new vocabulary. And what we know about research about language arts development and vocabulary development in general is that that's really not true for many students. There are actually very few students who actually incorporate new vocabulary simply by learning a definition. So one thing you're going to think about today is how we can then move beyond that kind of archaic and narrow goal set for implementing vocabulary. But the first thing we want to do is kind of take a current inventory of our vocabulary that we use currently. So take out your vocabulary list for your grade level. And I want you to take a few minutes by yourself and put a plus sign by terms that you feel students already use effectively. Put a minus sign by terms that you know students struggle using. And put a question mark by terms that you know students do not use. And maybe you don't know why they don't use them, or maybe you've never used them yourself in the course of instruction. So pause the session until you get that completed. And then I'd like for you to have a discussion about common terms that came up under each of these three categories, and maybe discuss why students maybe use some words more effectively than others, that kind of thing. So go ahead and pause, and then once you're finished with that discussion, you can start the session again. So as I mentioned before, we're going to try to get beyond this kind of, narrow definition of vocabulary being look up a word in the glossary and simply copy down a definition. And I'm pulling from the work of Robert Marzano as far as where these 5 steps for vocabulary acquisition came from. And what we want to do as we think about important mathematics words is we want to think more robustly about how we help students actually learn to not only understand what the words mean, but also use them in an effective way in a mathematics context, in a classroom instruction context, and so on. And so I would challenge you to think about these steps for vocabulary acquisition. And the first step is for the teacher to present students with a brief explanation or a description of the new term or phrase. What does it mean? Why is it important? And this is kind of, a point to have discussion. Maybe the children have a meaning that they have for the word. And then the second step is to present students with a non-linguistic representation of the new term and phrase. And that non-linguistic is very important, that it is something that is pictorial in nature, or some other kind of maybe it's environmental. Maybe we think about a rectangle and we look at the shape of our door for very young children. And so it's really important that this non-linguistic become a hook for the students. And that's given from the teacher as a way to kind of guide their understanding. And those are the 2 steps. Those first 2 steps are the ones that are really teacher driven. Once you have done this, then the next 3 steps actually become very student driven. So then what you want to do is ask students to, based on those first two steps, create their own explanations or descriptions of the term and phrase. And the public discussion of those explanations is very important, because you want to have students hear each other's kind of, grade and age level appropriate explanations, and also then you can guide their understanding to make it as precise as it needs to be for the given mathematical topic. You want to ask students to create their own non-linguistic representation of the term or phrase. Maybe it's in shape, some examples and non-examples of a certain shape. Maybe it's a picture that students draw to help them remember. And then lastly, and this is the part where the definitions actually come into play, periodically you want to ask students to review how accurate their explanations are. Students develop mathematical ideas over time, which it's fair to say that then students develop mathematics vocabulary over time. And so their understanding of the terms that they're using in class will become more concreted in their minds, as well as kind of more precise as time goes along. And it's really only in this step 5 that you get out that definition and say, okay, so if this is what we agree is a definition that maybe math people came up with, or however you want to present it, then let's review how accurate our explanation is and our representations are. So what I want you to do is to take that chart paper and that marker, if you're working as a group, and I want you to pick one vocabulary word that is especially problematic for students in your grade level. And I want you to actually go through this process as if you were the teacher for steps 1 and 2. And then you're going to trade papers with another group, and the other group is going to go through steps 3, 4, and 5. This will probably take you about 20 minutes. Maybe 10 minutes to do steps 1 and 2, and then 10 minutes to switch papers. And once you get back with that, then I'll discuss some strategies, other strategies rather, for helping to support students' new mathematics vocabulary. So go ahead and pause the presentation and complete this activity, and then restart. So in addition to this 5-step process that's based on Robert Marzano's work on vocabulary acquisition, there are some other things that I'd like for you to think about as far as supporting students' new mathematics vocabulary. And the first one is to be patient. We expect language development in general to be something that is a process, not an event. And so we should expect that with mathematics vocabulary development. And so be very patient with your students if they're not using those words. You need to attend to the words actively so that you're really listening for those key words in terms of new vocabulary. And the second point here is extremely important, and it goes back to that kind of, making connections for students, is you really want to connect their informal to their formal words. If they're talking about slope in an algebra setting for higher level students, and they talk about the tilt of a line, they can use that word in an informal set, but you want to encourage them to use the word slope. You want to celebrate when students use one of those, mathematics vocabulary words that are really important. And whether it's just verbal praise or whether it's just, an overall class comment at the end of a lesson, you want to explicitly recognize that mathematics vocabulary is being used. And then the last piece, which is of critical importance when it comes to mathematics academic vocabulary, is you need to explicitly instruct students that some words have special meaning in mathematics. And I would encourage you to look at the end of this presentation. There's a web link for a resource from Math Solutions that's called Supporting English Language Learners in Math Class, but I think it's good for all students because it really talks about this issue of mathematics language development. And here are just 3 examples of a list of words they've generated in this resource that have a specific mathematical meaning that have different meanings in other contexts. The word difference. What's the difference between a weekend and a weekday? in terms of your activities. That's a discussion to have with very young children as far as schedule and sequencing goes, maybe when they're learning about, sequence of events and everything. But when we say difference in mathematics, that's a very specific mathematical operation of subtraction. And so I say, what's the difference between 8 and 13? Well, some children might informally say, well, one's a 2-digit number, the other one's a 1-digit number. But when we say difference, we want them to subtract 8 from 13 and say that the difference is 5. So here are 3 words that have very special meaning in mathematics, specific meaning in mathematics. And as I mentioned, the Math Solutions resource has a very complete list. But you might want to take a few minutes and pause the presentation and generate a list of these words for each grade level. Now, these words may or may not already be on your vocabulary list, and that's also an important addition you might want to make in terms of helping students use not only mathematics words that are just kind of math-based, but also those words that have a special meaning in mathematics. So if you want to hit pause and have a discussion on this topic, that would be good to do so at this time. So very closely connected to the development of students' mathematics vocabulary is this idea of supporting student writing in math classes. And there are 3 major goals I want you to think about as you support student writing in math class. And the first one is to make the content comprehensible. You can have students looking at writing about a math word, but if the content is not understandable to them, that's going to be a barrier to them. So we have to think about how we can make content comprehensible for students. We are also going to think about how we provide opportunities for writing. So we need to have them write about the right things. And then also as teachers, we need to be able to provide support for writing. And I'm going to share a couple of ideas about this in terms of how we do these 3 things. So when we think about ways to write about mathematics class, and we think about these ways that we support writing, I'm going to encourage you to think about some different kind of categories, if you will, as far as things to write about. What I see a lot in math classes is 2 things. First, students write about the procedure they used to solve a math problem, which is not a bad thing. I multiplied 3 times 4 and got 12. I also see kids doing a lot of writing in complete sentences to explain what their answer means. I multiplied 3 times 4 to get 12. Martha has 12 apples in all. So they're writing what the answer means. Those are 2 very basic steps, but I'm going to encourage you to think more kind of globally about writing a math class that maybe will take some of the barriers away that some students feel. And the first thing is just to have students describe what they see. It can be a term. It can be something like a triangle has 3 sides, 3 vertices, and no curves. It can be, 13 has 1 10 and 3 1s. So they can just be simply describing a term or a number, a location. But you want to make it so that students are more clearly, defining what a problem is or what a picture is. So before you actually have them jump in and solve the math and write about how they solved it, they can simply describe what they see. The second strategy then to think about is for students to categorize things. And so you might think about, about number or about shape. A rectangle is a polygon because it is not necessarily a square because. So you can give them kind of these sentence prompts that help them categorize mathematical terms, or for older kids, you can think about, functions, categorizing families of functions, any kind of classification. You can have students write about the categorization, but it needs to have that at the first, just that description, but as students get more advanced, you can add that because kind of clause. Certainly, you can have students compare and contrast. That's not a, not a new one necessarily, but I will tell you that when they compare and contrast, they need to be comparing and contrasting about mathematical ideas and not superficial ideas. So that's an important point to make there. You can have students write about summarizing and drawing conclusions, and that goes back to kind of what I was talking about at the outset of this slide, as far as, you know, this problem means, you know, that she has enough apples to give to her friends, you know. So this whole idea about addressing a scenario and not just getting to an answer is also a way you can have students summarize. You can have students write about the sequence of events that they did in solving a problem, but they can also write about the sequence of events that happen in a scenario. So, an important point in sequencing is, are there any assumed steps? My children were doing homework the other night about putting ribbon around a rectangle, and the question was, how much ribbon is left over? Excuse me. And how much ribbon is left over? And so, you know, there is an assumption then that you do a subtraction there, rather than just finding out how much ribbon you used. And so talking about the sequence of what you actually are finding out is a great way to write about mathematics. These last two, even though they're at the bottom, I actually think they might be the easiest to implement and also the most effective to implement quickly and get students to have success. And the first one is about this hypothesizing and predicting. You want students to predict what they think will happen for their answer, predict what they think will happen, you know, if they solved a similar problem. So, you know, do they think their answer will be big or little? What operation will they use? Predict. They can hypothesize. They can write their own questions. So those are ways to kind of engage them in the content initially without having them get so caught up in the specific mathematics. And that also then pulls in, you know, if you want to think about kind of differentiating for all levels of students, hypothesizing and predicting is a great way to pull in even your most struggling students and have them write their hypothesis or their prediction. And then, of course, at the end, to go back and reflect on that. Was your prediction correct? Yes or no? Hypothesizing and prediction is great in modeling for older students. It's also great to use in measurement with younger students. And then lastly, another strategy to get students to write about mathematics is giving or following directions. You can have students write their own math problems, you know, give directions on their own math problems similar to what they did before. You could have them write a letter to a student who was absent about, you know, the mathematical topic you went through today or the problems you solved. You could also do this, you know, as far as having students, you know, discuss what will happen when they follow certain directions. They can analyze each other's directions. Now, I have this titled as Ways to Write about Mathematics, but for very young children and for struggling older students, you can cross out the word write and you can just write the word talk. Because what you want to do first, if writing is a struggle for students, just have them speak about the mathematics. You can do all of these categories of writing about mathematics in an oral sense, and that will get students processing mathematics in a different way and prepare them for the eventual writing about mathematics. So in summary, what I want you to think about is that vocabulary and writing in mathematics are all about language development. You may want to go back to the previous slide and take a few minutes and modify that assignment you brought with you to see how am I helping with my students' language development and adding writing into my current assignment. But as you do that, you need to isolate what the actual issue is when students are struggling. Are they struggling with the mathematics? Is the mathematical topic so new or so difficult that that's causing the problem? Is it the vocabulary? Do they understand what the word expression means? Do they understand what the word represent means? So it's not just mathematics vocabulary, it's also assignment vocabulary. And you might want to go back to that assignment you brought and see, is the vocabulary load in that assignment too heavy? Is it the writing component? So if you're trying to accomplish new learning in all three goals of this at once, math, vocabulary, and writing, students are going to get very frustrated, even your most capable students. So what you need to try to do is isolate the problem. So is it that the mathematical topic is so new that students are struggling? So I may need to pull back from the writing and from the vocabulary for a minute and just try to work them through the math in a less formal sense and connect it to something they previously learned, and then inject the new vocabulary or inject a writing strategy as a way to help them further their development. Is it the vocabulary I'm using? So maybe I need to back off of the mathematics. The classic one is, maybe there's a problem involving measurement where kids are having trouble understanding what units they're using, but maybe the trouble is actually that there are fractions involved in the measurement or decimals involved, and that's causing the math is causing the problem. So you can back down on the math as far as what some of the numbers mean, or maybe the complexity of the situation, and try to get them to use the vocabulary in a simpler setting. And then, as I mentioned before, is the problem that students are having trouble writing? And I talked before about, you may want to just orally ask them to explain what they're thinking, or summarize, or compare and contrast, so that then the writing becomes a scribing of what they were saying orally, and then they'll gradually transition to be more spontaneous on the writing piece. Once you isolate that problem, you need to take that burden off. What I'm trying to say is, so if the burden is the vocabulary, then we need to provide them with the vocabulary, or reinforce what we're trying to mean when we use certain words, and then communicate that with them. That the struggle wasn't that they don't understand math, or that they don't understand, or that they're bad math students. It's that we're asking them to communicate with different words in a different way and to write down. And this is also a great place to involve parents in this discussion as well. You can very quickly send home a vocabulary list with parents, have them make sure that when they talk to their child, they're using these words. Maybe the child has to give the adult the words in their own kind of oral definition kind of thing. So the important thing is that you're really kind of rewarding the mathematics or the vocabulary that the students do know, and helping them build on that to tackle all three of these goals. So as I mentioned before, some of the materials I used for this presentation were taken from a Math Solutions resource called Supporting English Language Learners in Math Class. Has a lot of different strategies as well as some classroom scenarios that are good to analyze. And I'm also providing a couple of other different web links for vocabulary sites to use with students. And then the bottom link there is actually from the Common Core State Standards website that has a math glossary that they use. It's not the most user-friendly, but if you want to get kind of like a better understanding about what the standard writers mean when they use certain terms, you can reference that as well. I encourage you to take time at the end of this session and discuss what topics were addressed. Take a look back at your chart paper and see how well maybe you've represented the vocabulary. Take a look at your current assignments and see how you can incorporate more writing. And as always, I welcome any feedback or any further questions to the email address at the beginning of the session. Thank you.